Okay, in this video, we're going to take a look at the image adjustments for changing the contrast and levels, and then we'll move on to taking a look at some color correction, like changing the hue, the saturation levels, and the color balance. So let's start with contrast and levels. Let me go back to my color photograph here. And most of the image adjustments are located in the image menu under adjustments, and then you'll see there's a wide variety here. So I'm going to start with the basics and show them to you in the image menu, and then this will make a relatively permanent change to the photograph. There's also, some of you might be familiar with, there's a way to do these same adjustments on what's called an adjustment layer that does not make a permanent change. But let's take a look at them here first. So image adjustments, and I'm going to start with things that change the contrast. So I'll start with brightness contrast. That's the most basic. And to be honest, I don't use this a lot, but it really helps to understand the introduction to how contrast works on the image. So brightness either increases the brightness or decreases the brightness, and contrast either increases the contrast or decreases. So it becomes a relationship of, okay, I made it brighter, so then I'm going to make it more contrast, or maybe I have to bring down, and you have to kind of go back and forth and negotiate between the two. And then you have a preview button here where you can look at the before and after. So I'm going to cancel out of that. The one that I like a little bit better is levels. And I like this because under input levels here, so everything in this center area is what you're going to be using. You're not going to use output levels. I'll show you what that does. That simply reduces the contrast. That's a really great thing if you're doing a graphic design piece and you need to have some white type on top of this, and you just want a subtle photograph underneath. You can greatly reduce the contrast, and then you can do your more graphic design using that. But for straight photography, which is our goal in this, I just want to do the input levels. So just like brightness and contrast, this can increase the highlights by pulling that away from the edge. It can increase the shadows. So you can see that these three little triangles here are actually the color of what they adjust. So this is white, it adjusts the lights. This is dark, this adjusts the shadows. And this is my favorite one. This is the midtones. So this can take the overall feeling of things, and sometimes it can bring out more detail in areas that were previously completely in shadow, but there was information in the photograph. So if I wanted to see more of this detail, I could lighten that and then darken just the shadows. So let's take a look at the difference there. So there's the start. And there's the other one. So it kind of depends on what it is that I want to accomplish with this adjustment. Other times, a good rule of thumb, if I just reset this, is that the photographs usually come in where the blacks are not fully black and the highlights are not fully highlight. So usually you want to pull in the white triangle and the dark triangle just a little bit to start to get the image to pop a little bit. I'm going to cancel out of this because I want to show you that some of the color corrections will also increase the contrast. So if I go to Image Adjustment, Hue, Saturation, here on this palette, I'm going to look at the saturation level. Sometimes just by bringing up the saturation of the color, it will actually increase the contrast a little bit. Let me pull it a little bit more. The preview allows me to look at the before and the after. So it's subtle, but sometimes I like to do this first and then do the levels, and sometimes I go back and forth. So that's the saturation. What I don't want you to do here is this. You can do that for your own work at home, for personal work, as much as you want, but for class work, I want you to keep this within the believable range of color. And then hue also can do some crazy graphic things, which you can experiment with as much as you want. but for our project, you would use this primarily to, a lot of times photographs will come out a little bit too yellow. So sometimes I'll just shift this a little bit to the left to bring in a tiny bit more red and a little bit less yellow, especially if you're working with skin tones or it was photographed in fluorescent lighting and you want a slightly more um, flattering skin tone, you'll sometimes push this a little bit towards the reds. And then this also affects the lightness and darkness of the color. For the most part, I usually leave that alone. Okay, let me cancel out of that again. And then the other color correction is image adjustments, color balance. This is different than the hue saturation in that it lets you tweak the color. So if, for instance, again, if my goal was to get the yellows out, I could get the yellows out of the highlights, get them out of the shadows or the midtones, or I could go through and do all of them. So if I do the highlights and I take the yellow and I move away from the yellow, I'm going to be increasing the amount of blue in the highlight areas. It does affect a little bit the midtones and the shadows as well. So it's not just targeting the highlights, but it tweaks the cast a little bit. So let's say I was moving that a little bit more towards the blues, and then in the shadows, I was moving a little bit more towards the reds, and went back to the highlights. I'm going to do this a little more extreme than I normally would. And there you can start to see the difference. And sometimes it's not until you go back and forth on the preview that you can see that there was this greenish yellow cast on there before. But I do think I overdid this a little bit. So I'm going to go back and make that a little more subtle, and then I'll do the preview. So you see that just gave it a little bit more of a warmth in the yellows, and then a little more blue as opposed to green in the sky. Then I can say OK to that. So let me show you what I might do to this. I might do that and then do some hue saturation. Maybe I'll increase the saturation a little bit. I can also do some selective color here. I can come down and choose just the yellows, and I can make just the yellows a bit brighter. If I go to the extreme, you can really see what it's going to adjust. So it's not, sometimes what we think is yellow, we might also be affecting the color in other parts that we didn't notice the yellow in. So sometimes doing this helps you see what it's going to change. Then maybe I just increase that a little bit. And if I wanted the yellow to be more green, I could move it this way. If I wanted it to be more orange, I could move it the other way. Let me take a look at the preview. Okay, I think I got that to pop a little bit more. Let me just see if now I did take this building and make it look a little bit greener by doing that. So I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it, but I'm going to go ahead and say okay. And now let me go to my history palette so you can see this has all the steps that I've taken so far. So if I go back to right before I started to do the color balance, I can see how it looked before and how it looks with my adjustments. I can also go all the way back to the beginning and see how it started. Now you want to be a little bit careful with this history in that if you go back, you can go forward, but if you go back and then you make a change, then what you did before is going to disappear. So if I accidentally do that, I can do Command Z and I can get that back once. But if I make two changes, then I've gone back in time and now I can't come back to the present anymore. I will be stuck permanently in the past. Let's see. So then I did the color correction, and now just looking at this, I might do a little bit of levels. I don't want to lose those blues there, though. I like that. So let me see, I'll make that pop a little bit, and then maybe I'll go back to hue saturation. I'm going to do Command U to get hue saturation, and I'm going to select the cyans. In the cyans, I think I want to make a little more purpley blue, not unrealistic, and then increase the saturation a little bit. Let's see, do I want to make it darker? No, not really. Okay, let me preview that. Not much of a change, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. And then the rest of the adjustments I'm going to do with targeted, like I might want to bring out the highlights in just this area, and then I might want to increase the blueness in just these areas. So we're going to talk about targeted adjustments in just a minute.